Where is God in a coronavirus world? You know, as I film this video, here in the UK, we're under lockdown, as many countries in the world are, and struggling to cope with a pandemic that's causing chaos and destruction. And many people are asking all kinds of questions. And a question that often arises is where is God in the midst of all this?
Where indeed? Even in an ordinary world, our planet is so infused with such suffering that it can be famously difficult to imagine that an omnipotent and benevolent supervisor is watching over all of it without electing to prevent it. But certainly the current coronavirus pandemic has brought the problem into sharp focus. Over 5 million people who were alive just 2 years ago are now reported dead as a result of this disease, and many more have been hurt, immobilized, lost loved ones, lost livelihoods, and not to mention all of the time that we've spent stuck indoors. If I ever needed a reminder of how absolutely insane our present situation is, I found it when my government couldn't decide whether it should be legal to sit on a park bench. But as incompetent as our own world leaders have been in dealing with this pandemic, religious believers are committed to the view that there is an even higher authority watching over this too, an omnipotent, all-loving and all-knowing authority, which they call God. And so if we're going to criticize our politicians for their incompetence in dealing with this pandemic, we may have a right to ask why the King of the universe himself, in refusing to prevent this in the first place, appears to display a level of incompetence or callousness so infinitely large that I almost want to recommend that he run for Parliament. Now, the man we just heard from is Dr. Andy Bannister, who is about to explain why he thinks a loving God may have permitted the coronavirus pandemic to take place. Dr. Bannister is an author and professor with a PhD and director of the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, an established thinker, no doubt, but his YouTube channel is significantly smaller than mine, and so while I respond to him here, please do refrain from going to his channel if you're going to hound him with dislikes or leave unproductive comments and things like that. That's not how we do things if we want to call ourselves the sensible side of YouTube. With that said, let's hear what Dr. Bannister, who I've responded to on other topics in the past, has to say in answer to this question: where is God in a coronavirus world?
And you know, the way I want to begin thinking about that question is it struck me as the virus has unfolded and as we've experienced, living under lockdown conditions. One of the things I find fascinating is that coronavirus raises all kinds of religious and spiritual questions. It's exposed a number of things. One of the first things I think that coronavirus has exposed is that science can't answer everything.
Okay, so this is point 1 of 4 that Dr. Bannister makes. COVID has shown us that science can't answer everything. Now, I don't think that science can answer everything, but Dr. Bannister thinks that even the question of how to deal with a virus like COVID is not a scientific question, or at least not a solely scientific question. Let's hear why.
But, we live in an age that's encouraged us to think that science can answer everything. In terms of dealing with the virus, you hear people saying, we just need to follow the science. But in recent days and weeks, it's emerged, of course, that actually, which science are we talking about? There are scientists with equally long lists of credentials to their names who disagree profoundly about the best way to deal with this virus. And I think governments are discovering that actually the response that is required by leadership, yes, it needs to be informed by the science, but actually politics is what's needed. And politics and science are not the same thing. And I think coronavirus has exposed that actually science is really helpful in certain areas, but it can't actually help us make big decisions about how we structure societies given what we're facing.
Okay, so this is a weird point, if you ask me. Dr. Bannister argues that science can't tell us how to deal with the virus, and we know this because there are lots of scientists who all disagree about how to deal with the virus and can't converge upon a single solution. But how on earth does this show that science cannot, in principle, allow us to discover the best way to deal with the virus at some point in the future? The fact that people disagree about what the science currently shows doesn't mean that there isn't an objectively correct scientific answer out there that will be discovered and agreed upon at a later date. And whilst politics is undoubtedly getting in the way of this process, is Dr. Bannister suggesting that he likes that this is happening? I should hope not. I should hope that he would condemn the influence of political bias over our response to the virus and hope that in the future it will be science alone that informs our decision-making. Like, yeah, sure, people still disagree about where the virus came from and how to interpret the data and all that kind of stuff. But the fact that scientists disagree about what the correct scientific answer is doesn't mean there isn't a correct scientific answer to be discovered. I mean, consider an analogy. A few hundred years ago, nobody knew what caused diseases. Different scientists had lots of competing theories. One of the most popular was the miasma theory, that there was this kind of bad air that came off of decomposing matter, which was thought to transmit diseases like chlamydia or the Black Death. That was one theory. Some others thought that diseases came from evil spirits or as a punishment from God. Others still believed that these things called germs might cause diseases. An early form of the germ theory of disease was proposed by the great Persian polymath Ibn Sina or Avicenna, but this was disregarded by European scientists who favoured the miasma theory. In other words, nobody could agree what caused diseases. People wondered, whose science do we follow? So the question of what causes diseases can't be answered by science, right? Well, that's what Dr. Bannister's logic would have us believe. Because scientists currently disagree, the question can't be answered by science. But this is, of course, ridiculous. It was a scientific question all along. Now, I'm not trying to argue that science can answer everything. I don't think it can. I don't think it can answer questions of meaning, for example. There are lots of things that science can't answer. But to claim that the question of how to prevent and control a disease is not a scientific one because scientists currently disagree about what the right answer is and that politics is getting in the way is like saying that the question of how to cure cancer is not a scientific one because scientists can't currently agree on the right approach. Don't mistake the impotence of human beings for the impotence of the scientific method in principle.
So that's the first thing. I think the coronavirus has also revealed that many of us have put our trust in things that are profoundly fallible. You know, for many of us, particularly in the Western world, we had our very nice lives set up. You know, we had our job and we had our standard of living, and we had the sports that we were into. We had our community of friends. For Christians, we had our churches. Everything was structured and nice and ordered, and life was wonderful. And along came this pandemic and has swept all of those things away. And I think for many people, it's exposed that actually maybe the things we were placing our hope and our certainty and our confidence in are not actually what they were cracked up to be.
Okay, so here's Dr. Bannister's second point. Why might God allow COVID? Because it forces us to reevaluate where we place our trust and find our meaning. Think very carefully about what's being said here. Dr. Bannister is saying that COVID has shown us that whenever we think we're comfortable in life, whenever we find contentment, whenever we're happy with the way that our life is going, God, if he pleases, can allow a virus to destroy it all at a moment's notice just to remind us where our loyalties are supposed to lie. Listen again.
Everything was structured and nice and ordered, and life was wonderful. And along came this pandemic and has swept all of those things away. And I think for many people, it's exposed that actually maybe the things we were placing our hope and our certainty and our confidence in are not actually what they were cracked up to be.
Is this not just the most mobster-esque observation you've ever heard? Hey, nice life you've got there. Comfortable job, loving family. It'd be a shame if I took it all away with a debilitating virus, just in case you forgot that I'm supposed to be the source of your happiness, not them. Dr. Bannister is suggesting that by allowing COVID to wipe out those earthly things in which we find happiness and meaning, we're reminded that all along we should have been placing our trust and our happiness in God instead, and not these destructible earthly things. That is, God is willing to wipe out those things that bring us happiness and meaning, even going so far as to kill our friends and our family, or forcing them to undergo grief and hardship, just to remind us who's really in charge. It's as if God is saying, just in case you forget that I'm the one who deserves your attention and your worship, let me mercilessly kill and destroy those things that you love, just to remind you that you should have been focusing on me all along. Your happiness comes from me, okay? And don't even think about trying to get it from somewhere else. But it seems clear to me that this is not the kind of God that most Christians actually believe in. I don't think Christians think that God is some kind of mobster who acts in this manner. But if you suggest, as Dr. Bannister has just done, that part of the reason God might allow COVID to occur is because it forces us to realize that we should really be finding meaning in God rather than earthly happiness, it commits you to the view that God is willing to ravage our society just to remind us who the boss is. Now, I don't think that's a God that any Christian would want to believe in, and so perhaps this isn't a particularly good argument to use.
The third thing I think coronavirus has revealed that I find fascinating is it's revealed also how instinctively Christian many of our societies are. I mean, if you think about coronavirus and what it's doing purely in atheistic and naturalistic terms, you could argue that here we have, Darwinianism revealed in all of its glory, because along has come this virus, and what's it doing? It's primarily predating on the weak, the poor, the elderly, those who simply don't measure up biologically. It's thinning out the weak. We see survival of the fittest in all of its glory.
Oh boy. So this is point number 3. Now Dr. Bannister is saying that if you're an atheist, you also have to be a social Darwinist who thinks that the strong should wipe out the weak and we should just let nature run its course, and that we have no right to prevent COVID from evolving because that's just how evolution works. It's survival of the fittest in all its glory, to quote Dr. Bannister. This is such a common misconception about evolution, which confuses a historical fact, what happened, with moral advice, what should happen. Yes, I'm an atheist, and I believe that evolution by survival of the fittest best explains how life evolved on Earth. I think that we're here as a result of survival of the fittest. But this in no way commits me to thinking that we should allow the principle of survival of the fittest to structure our society today. I can accept as a historical fact that something happened in the past that's responsible for our existence, without thinking that we should repeat that historical event. Imagine, by way of analogy for a moment, that I only existed because of some horrible historical fact. Suppose, for example, that I were a child that resulted from sexual abuse. Now, fortunately, I wasn't, but if I were, I could say that the horrible fact that a man abused a woman explains why I exist today. Now, just imagine if someone were to say to me, well, if you think sexual abuse explains how you got here, you must think that sexual abuse is moral. That would be obviously ridiculous. That doesn't even make any sense. But that's exactly what people do when they say, well, if you think survival of the fittest and death of the weak explains how we got here today, you must think that allowing the weak to die is morally fine. Clearly, this doesn't follow. Believing in evolution as a historical fact does not commit us to thinking that we should just allow evolution to do whatever it will in the future without intervention. Don't confuse something explaining how we got here with it prescribing how we ought to behave today.
But isn't it interesting that we're not responding that way? No government minister, no matter how atheistic they are, has come out and gone, let's just let the virus kill as many old people as possible because society will get stronger. We all instinctively know that's not the right approach, and so most societies have crashed their economies in order to protect the weak and the vulnerable and the elderly. Fascinating. That's a profoundly Christian response, not a profoundly atheistic response.
I'm sorry. What? Now Dr. Bannister says that not wanting the weak and the vulnerable to die from COVID is a, quote, profoundly Christian response. This is palpably absurd. Not only are atheists perfectly entitled to also care about the vulnerable of society, and in fact do on the whole, but are you also forgetting about the thousands of religions other than Christianity? Dr. Bannister says that caring about the weak and not wanting them to die of COVID is profoundly Christian. I'm sorry to say, Dr. Bannister, Christianity does not have a monopoly on caring for the weak. I'm sure you'll know, for instance, that one of the 5 pillars of Islam is zakat, or compulsory charity, that is, caring for the weak and the vulnerable. You don't think Buddhists or Jains or even non-religious movements like socialism or effective altruism also care about the weak and the vulnerable? To say that not wanting the elderly or the vulnerable to die from COVID is a specifically Christian response is one of the most bizarre things you possibly could have said in a video which, by the way, is supposed to be explaining how a good God could allow COVID to happen in the first place. How about we stop peddling this myth that to be an atheist is necessarily to be a self-centered moral nihilist who is incapable of or unjustified in caring about the elderly or the vulnerable, apparently, by the way, due to the belief that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor. I think that's maybe something of a non sequitur. We atheists are perfectly capable, by the way, of caring for the vulnerable, and I dare say that it's the religious who have the harder task of explaining how their God can claim to care for the vulnerable, whilst also being the same God who refused to prevent the very disease that's making them vulnerable in the first place. Who's really got more explaining to do here? If I believed in and worshipped an all-powerful creator who has elected to silently invigilate this deadly pandemic, I wouldn't be so quick to claim that it's my worldview that really cares the most about the protection of the elderly and the vulnerable. I'd instead be asking why on earth they need protecting from what is, after all, a divinely preventable pandemic in the first place.
And then lastly, I think the other thing that I think the coronavirus has exposed is that many of us are simply not used to thinking about our mortality. We've kidded ourselves into the fact that, we're going to live forever and nothing can touch us. Look at us, aren't we clever with all the science and technology we have? And suddenly along comes a pandemic and it reveals that we are mortal. And we need to think about some of those big questions that we've possibly been avoiding.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree that this sounds an awful lot like scare tactics. Now Dr. Bannister is suggesting that God will kill your friends and family in order to remind you that death's going to come to you one day too. When a dictator like Hitler or Stalin comes to power, one of the first things he'll do is go about killing or imprisoning people as a demonstration of his power, just to remind his people that their life can be taken away too, and so they'd better appreciate that dear leader is keeping them alive, at least for now. You can watch on YouTube the footage of Saddam Hussein, after officially coming to power in 1979, publicly purging members of the Ba'ath Party, executing them via firing squad as a reminder that he could kill you too. Now think about what Dr. Bannister has just said. God might be allowing COVID to serve the spiritual purpose of being a reminder of your mortality, demonstrating that we're all susceptible to dying at any moment, which might make people consider coming to faith. It's as if God is sitting there thinking, well, they're getting a little too comfortable and happy, and not enough of them believe in me. I'd better remind them just how easily I can crush them, killing their friends and killing their family, just to remind them that they're going to die one day too, and so they'd better come to me for refuge. And does God deliver this reminder of our mortality, to put it lightly, universally and equally? No. Some people will be absolutely fine and remain virtually unaffected by the virus, especially the rich with their large estates and money for medical bills. They'll be much better off. God delivers this virus in such a way that it mostly desolates the global poor and the elderly and the immunocompromised. And why? Well, of course, because God sees it fit to use such people as disposable means to an end, killing them to remind us, the lucky ones, that we're mortal, because apparently everyone's got it into their heads that death isn't a thing that exists anymore. I have to say, I just don't see it. Now, I want to issue a friendly reminder and perhaps a throat clearing that this video isn't even arguing that God doesn't exist. Most Christians, as I say, do not believe in the kind of God that I've just characterized. They believe that God is loving and cares about the vulnerable and suffers with them and is justified in everything that he does. I just think that whilst God may have some unknown or unknowable reasons for permitting this COVID pandemic, those reasons probably won't be anything like the ones that we've just heard from Dr. Andy Bannister. And until I can hear some better examples, I just don't think that an all-powerful supervisor is something that I can believe in. But I'll tell you something that I can believe in and do quite strongly, and that's internet security. That's right, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is a virtual private network designed to protect your internet security when browsing online. Maybe something you haven't really thought about much, but if, for instance, you're connected to an unencrypted Wi-Fi network, hackers on that same network could be stealing your data. Internet service providers can also see all of the websites that I visit and are required by law in my country to keep logs of this information. If you live in the United States, then ISPs can sell this data to advertisers and to big tech. And this is happening with many people being blissfully unaware that they've become a product. And this is why I've been using ExpressVPN, which is a simple app that runs on your computer or smartphone. You simply open the app, choose a location, and turn it on, and then ExpressVPN will reroute your data through a separate secure server in the location of your choice, which masks your IP address and hides your location, allowing you to browse much more anonymously but also allowing you to, for instance, access online content that isn't usually available in your own country by making it seem as though you're located elsewhere in the world. So that's how, for instance, I'm able to access US Netflix despite living in the UK. And ExpressVPN is so lightning fast that you won't even notice that you have it running, since it will barely affect your internet speed. And the best part is this. You can get 3 months of all of this, all the stuff I've just mentioned, completely for free by simply visiting expressvpn.com/cosmic skeptic or by clicking on the link in the description. And if you do, I'm sure you'll agree that it was well worth your time and start using it all the time, just like I've been doing. With that said, I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.